A historic day in the United States as former President Donald Trump pleads not guilty to 34 felony counts, making him the first U.S. president in history to face a criminal trial. And in a historic shift, Finland joins NATO, triggered by the war in Ukraine, prompting anger in Russia, where officials have cast the move as a threat. This is All 24 News Special. On Tuesday, former President Donald Trump pleaded not guilty to more than 30 felony counts over hush money case related to his presidential campaign in 2016, according to law officials. The former president left New York for Florida, where he's expected to deliver a speech on Tuesday evening. Here's Islam Said.
U.S. former President Donald Trump on Tuesday pleaded not guilty before a judge to 34 felonies of falsifying business record after he faced a grand jury indictment arising from fraud case and violating other election laws during his 2016 presidential campaign.
We today uphold our solemn responsibility to ensure that everyone stands equal before the law. 34 false statements made to cover up other crimes. These are felony crimes in New York State.
Today's unsealing of this indictment shows that the rule of law died in this country. Because while everyone is not above the law, no one's below it either. And if this man's name was not Donald J. Trump, there is no scenario we'd all be here today. Please understand that based on these charges.
Moments before his arraignment, his supporters rallied outside the New York court, whistling, shouting, and raising posters in support of the former president.
Trump has done so much for our country during the 4 years. So that's why, and I support him, and I want to show my support. I want to protest this brag bro that there's a ridiculous case. It was not a case at all. They just try to pick up a little bit of things and to accuse Trump and stop him to run 2024.
Trump has already announced his candidacy for president in 2024. Just a couple of days before his arraignment, Trump posted a video on Truth Social asking his supporters to contribute money for his 2024 campaign. It is a turning point for the United States as Trump is set to become the first U.S. president to be charged with such crime. The charges together have a potential punishment for more than 100 years in jail under New York law. However, the actual prison term, if he's found guilty at trial, would almost definitely be much lower. Trump left Manhattan courthouse and headed to LaGuardia Airport. According to officials, he was due to return to Florida and deliver remarks from his Mar-a-Lago resort on Tuesday evening.
And in the first chapter of today's special, we will be talking to Mark Lowe, expert on international relations from Genoa, Italy, and Mr. Adam Roosevelt, national security expert, foreign affairs and political analyst, military strategist from Washington. He's currently based at Dubai. And Mr. Dennis Speed, political analyst, founding member of Scheller Institute from New Jersey. Gentlemen, thank you for agreeing to be with us. Let's start with you, Mr. Mark Lowe. Donald Trump is the first ex-president ever to face criminal charges, and it's true that this might take a while, but what are we to expect to unfold in this case? He already pleaded not guilty to 34 felony counts of falsifying business records, but what is next, according to you?
Well, I think in a scenario where logic has been thrown completely to the wind, this could actually be to Donald Trump's advantage. As he has already claimed, this, according to Trump and according to Trump's lawyers, is a politicized case. This is a scenario where the institutions have ganged up against the former president. So in reality, and taking into consideration Trump's electoral base, what we are looking at is a scenario that potentially could be beneficial to his candidacy next year. So it will be very, very interesting to watch and follow how all of this develops. Now, if I am not wrong, the next installment, if you like, will not be until December of this year, so shortly before the official candidacies will be launched. So Trump has a good few months in front of him to make a gain from something that, in a normal world, would be something that would end any politician's career.
Very nice indeed. And Mr. Adam Roosevelt, how do you read this yourself? Is it a moment of triumph and supremacy of law and the principle that everyone is equal before the law, no matter who you are? Or is the law here being politicized? Something to pick up on what Mr. Marklow just said.
Well, first, let me say thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be among the esteemed guests. The first question is, what are we focusing on in terms of these continuous investigations? I think we can all agree as Americans that the rule of law is very important, but I'm also very interested in making sure we protect the Constitution and what we've built as the American people. So these 34 counts of the falsification of these business records, we obviously need to review what's been released in this unsealed package before the legal team is actually able to address and provide a defense argument to each of these particular counts. I do think that this is overly politicized from the aspect of the election conversation, because I do know that from a state perspective, it is within scope of conversation for election violations, but this was something that I would have anticipated from the federal level if they were going to take this particular investigation forward and accuse the former president. So I think there's some political elements and some questions regarding the business records that need to be reviewed more intensively.
And Mr. Adam Roosevelt, what's your observation on how the protests have been shaping up?
In terms of the protests, I think that, the president has a large group of supporters, me being one of them, but I'm also involved in looking at the National Republican Congressional Committee, the National Republican Senate Committee, and making sure that the alignment is in the defense of the best interests of the country. But from a political perspective, I think the protests are to support the president and making sure that he's given a fair trial in this process.
Very nice. And let me get back to you here, Mr. Marklow. What is your observation on what is happening here? Do you think that this is going to be beneficial for Donald Trump when it comes to the presidential campaign of 2024?
Well, let me, before that, just go back to something that Dr. Roosevelt mentioned, which is very, very important. Mm-hmm. And it is the fact that every effort must be made to ensure that former President Trump does receive a fair and just trial, that any actions against him are exactly the same as any actions against any other citizen would actually be. So this is very, very important. There are some who will argue that it is very politicized, others who will argue the contrary. What is important is for the justice system to prove that everything is fair and everything is anything but politicized. That said, I do remain of the opinion that Trump can make political capital out of this. I do firmly believe that a number of his supporters will view this as absolutely politicized, as a measure that has been taken forward to try and block any future political ambition, which, as we already know, is exactly what Donald Trump has for the next round of presidential elections. So I do actually think that, ironically, this could actually be very, very positive for Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm. And here, let me get back to you, Mr. Adam Roosevelt. How is this case playing out in the psyche of Americans?
There are different viewpoints, and one viewpoint would be the folks who believe that the Republican campaign, the Republican president, the Republican ideology is what they will stand by, they will effectively fall in line and state that this is a witch hunt, which is a term that has been consistently used in any investigation targeting President Trump. So I think that that's one perspective. And then on the Democratic side, I think there's different perspectives there, but the larger view is that they are getting their day in court. They are holding President Trump accountable for any actions that he may have committed prior to being president that may have been illegal, or even during the presidency. And we're seeing this all play out. And I think those two are very different perspectives, but they are pretty common in the American footprint view.
Very nice indeed. And here, let me bring up Mr. Dennis to the conversation here. Mr. Dennis Speed, how do you think this is going to affect Donald Trump's 2024 presidential campaign? As some experts say that these charges threaten to inject chaos in 2024 presidential campaign. And how are Republicans endorsing Trump amidst all of this?
Well, I actually think what will happen vis-a-vis the presidential campaign is that this will help Donald Trump immensely. But I also don't think that's what's actually going on. I think you're seeing, you have to embed what's happening here in the context of what has been an approximate 30-year unraveling of the presidency, starting with the presidency of Bill Clinton. That is various assaults on the presidency being made through the Department of Justice. What's really happening in the United States is that you're having a process of implosion of the institutions of the United States, because there are many different things that Donald Trump could have been indicted on. As the journalist Glenn Greenwald just pointed out a couple of days ago, this is about the worst indictment to have brought. It's 34 different counts, but each paragraph of the indictment is identical. In other words, it's just a bunch of checks, wires, and so on, and nothing is actually delineated in the indictment. It's a bare bones indictment. And various legal authorities are looking at this thing and saying, look, they should have told us they weren't going to say anything in the indictment, because people all over the world are trying to read it and figure it out. What's actually happening here is you're seeing the implosion of the American Republic. It's kind of like a feeding frenzy, and the party systems are disintegrating. That is what you're actually watching today occur in the United States. It's an historic day.
So it is not a case of bringing or making the law above everyone, no matter who you are, and it's not something that is being politicized?
No, it's precisely the opposite. It is making the law about a vendetta against a person who was president, but it's not about him. It's about the same thing that we've seen occur around, for example, the Nord Stream pipeline, where the United States clearly blew it up, but won't admit it. And what you've got is that the legislative branch won't hold the executive accountable. The executive branch is being destroyed by the judicial branch, and the judicial branch is held hostage, particularly to the banking system, where you've got all kinds of criminality that has been done by several bankers in the United States, including in the SVB bank case in California, and nobody will be prosecuted. You're seeing a general universal implosion of the institutions of self-government in the United States, and this is just one part of that.
And Mr. Dennis here, I know that this is another key question that as to when are we expecting a final ruling in this case, but this is definitely going to take a while. I mean, of lawyers making motion, dismissing charges, finding new evidences and so on. But what's, according to you, the before and after scenario here? And how is this going to be similar to the Capitol incident on January 6th?
There's no real similarity to January 6th here. What's going on here is that the transatlantic banking system, and specifically the banking system in the United States, is melting down. The Ukraine war was a complete fiasco, and the United States lost the financial war with Russia. What has happened is that Janet Yellen has become, instead of being the head of the Federal Reserve, a political operative, going personally and giving billion-dollar checks to Zelensky. So what you're seeing is that the political class of the United States has lost its way. It can't react, it can't respond appropriately to the fact that Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Russia, China, several other countries have decided they're de-dollarizing, The dollar will no longer be the basis of world credit because you can't trust the United States after they confiscated the $300+ billion of the Russians. And so what's happening is that there is a general failure on several fronts, and it's become conjunctural, by which I mean it's converging. And it converges around the figure of Donald Trump because he's a hated figure and he's a loved figure, but he's going to suck all the air out of the room as soon as you make him a focus. He is being created, he's being used as a diversion for the fact that the United States political class doesn't have a clue what to do.
Very nice indeed. And Mr. Adam Roosevelt, what are your comments regarding this, that the whole trial is just a diversion, a show to divert the opinion of the local opinion in the United States, Mr. Adam Roosevelt?
Well, I think it's actually a fantastic macro view if you can consolidate all of the geopolitical issues happening, as was mentioned, from the BRICS conversation to the Russia-Iran conversation. For sure, the goal is to make sure you can change the viewpoint of who will be the next future president to handle these macro issues. And these issues are very damaging to the United States. So I think that you may want to target the next person who may be the loudest person in the room, which is President Donald Trump. So that could be, let's say, an adopted CIA strategy for those who are politically astute in terms of leveraging these particular techniques and tactics to forecast and also manipulate the influence of the future outcome of an election. But I would say that, yes, this is a part of a larger strategy, but I think that it doesn't play well at the end for the Democratic Party. And I don't think that the President Trump, will lose. I think he will win this particular matter. And right now we can see how he's polling. We can also see how his ability to raise funds is really increasing his favorability amongst the Republican Party. And I think they may even be able to pull over some Democrats or some moderate Democrats to start questioning where the direction of America is going, because we all are about rule of law, but we also want to make sure we have stability in the country.
And Adam Roosevelt, former President Donald Trump, will be addressing supporters at his Mar-a-Lago estate tonight. Unlike the courtroom, he's expected to say whatever he wants now. Do you think that he'll galvanize his supporters regarding this affair?
Well, I can tell you that President Trump is one factor to consider. I have advised and worked with the National Republican Senate Committee. There's the RNC. There's also the NRCC, which is the National Republican Congressional Committee. These components, these bodies, are very strong arms and legs of how the president has his ability to be effective from a resource perspective, from a voice perspective, from a platform perspective. So Mar-a-Lago will be a headquarters, but those particular arms and legs will also provide strategic resources and a consolidated viewpoint on what the Republican Party will say and do collectively as one body to move with unity to make sure they maximize effectiveness across all messaging, all engagements, and then leading up to the presidential election in 2024.
And let me here invite Mr. Mark Lowe perhaps to comment on what has been stated already.
Well, very, very interesting to take the overall geopolitical situation into consideration. Very, very important to take America's role on the world stage into consideration, and specifically to try and scan the horizon and understand how many more changes will occur in the short term. There is, without a shadow of doubt, a certain amount of disillusion with what the United States was and what the United States has become in terms of a world power. We are seeing, as the other guest pointed out, some very, very radical changes. A lot of countries, for example, Saudi Arabia, and we only have to take a look at the OPEC being absolutely driven by Saudi Arabia. We only have to take a look at the decisions made over the weekend in terms of reducing oil output to understand that the world is changing. We are looking a new world order in the face. Things are changing very, very rapidly. Alliances are either falling to pieces or new alliances are being created in all of this. Where is the United States in terms of current policy and future policy? So there is absolutely a direct connection between who the next president of the United States of America will be, and not only America's role on the global stage, but possibly more importantly, the rest of the world's perception of the American role.
Mm-hmm. And here, Mr. Mr. Dennis Speed, can you put us in the picture here as what is happening in general in the United States, and how are the geopolitical changes in the world affecting what's happening inside?
I'm going to think about it this way. What they are seeing is various forms of economic crisis, financial crisis, which are beginning to hit. Of course, the banking crisis is still evolving. And every time that the president says, don't worry, then people begin to worry. That's obviously because if you take something like the Credit Suisse matter, it's very related to the SVB bank matter because it's one system, and that's part of it. But the way they're experiencing this is, for example, we're about to see 15 million people taken off Medicaid. Those are the poorest people in the country. It means that they won't have any medical coverage, or they won't be subsidized. Medicaid. Then there's, of course, what's happening at the gas pump, and that's another kind of thing. Then there's the inflation, which seems to correlate in some fashion, not with what Putin did, but what was happening actually just at not just at the gas pump, but what's happening with food prices. You can't blame the food price increase on Vladimir Putin. So Americans are very concerned about the nature of the economic crisis. And in addition, a lot of Americans would like to go back to the time when America was a productive economy, when it actually did manufacturing, it did mining, it had a much more extensive owner-operated agricultural sector. I think this is really what's actually on people's minds. Now, it doesn't mean they don't think about international matters, but I will put it this way to you. I think that the American people are going to be shocked into recognition that the Ukraine matter was a failure. And it was a failure that came right off Afghanistan. They sort of ran right into another war. And within a year, you have a situation where over $100 billion is given for that war. But also note something. Just a few days ago, the Union Bank of Switzerland, which bought Credit Suisse, was also guaranteed $108 billion by the Swiss National Bank. And people say, where's this money? Who runs this money? Who runs this power? And so what has happened for the American people is, as they see an indictment like this, which doesn't have any real much substance to it and much explanation, they are caused to think something completely else is going on here. Will someone please explain it to us? I think we could even see a renaissance, a near renaissance in the thinking process of Americans, a kind of upheaval that might actually, hopefully, propel new independent forces into the political fight in the next months.
Very nice. And as here we're watching live, Donald Trump arrived at Mar-a-Lago estate where he'll be delivering a speech to his supporters. Here, let me ask you, Mr. Adam Roosevelt, what kind of change is Donald Trump promising to Americans here that is different from what is happening, the war in Ukraine and the inflation at home? Do you think that he will bring that kind of change that the Americans are aspiring for?
I do. In fact, I think he has been one of the most controversial leaders to date, and that's primarily because of his engagement strategy on a number of different topics: foreign affairs, how he handled the engagement with Iran, how his position was very strong on how he was engaging the Taliban, his relationship with the Middle East, the border security strategy. So I was privileged to serve in the Homeland Security side. I was privileged to serve in the Department of Defense on the front lines of Afghanistan. So I was very close to these particular matters because I understand that there's a large block of people who are patriots who have put themselves in harm's way. And that essentially is the foundation of the patriotism that serves the country. People fight for that. They believe in that. And I think he's speaking very simply to a lot of people. And he did deliver on his campaign promises in this last election. This new phase will be about election reform and integrity, foreign policy, getting our foreign policy back in place and making America a respected nation in the Middle East, reestablishing those ties, reining in OPEC, making sure Iran is held accountable. These are the things that I think we're going to hear, but our domestic policy will be the first priority from the White House if President Donald Trump is able to regain the reins. We're going to have a major topic focus on domestic and foreign policy across those issue areas.
Mm-hmm. And just to shed some light on the foreign policy that might the U.S. actually witness here, let me bring Mr. Marklow. Mr. Marklow, can you tell us what kind of changes are we bracing for if Donald Trump is elected again as the President of the United States?
Further disturbance, further instability, more changes, and a greater distancing from the United States on the part of a number of nations, be they Asian
Mr. Marklow, excuse me to cut you right there. Actually, we just want to go live to what Donald Trump is saying right now to his supporters, and then we get back to discussion. Do we have the speech of Donald Trump?
God bless you all. God bless you all. And I never thought anything like this could happen in America. Never thought it could happen. The only crime that I have committed is to fearlessly defend our nation from those who seek to destroy it. From the beginning, the Democrats spied on my campaign. Remember that? They attacked me with an onslaught of fraudulent investigations. Russia, Russia, Russia. Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. Impeachment hoax number one. Impeachment hoax. State legislators. The millions of votes illegally stuffed into ballot boxes and all caught on government cameras. And just recently, the FBI and DOJ in collusion with Twitter and Facebook in order not to say anything bad about the Hunter Biden laptop from hell, which exposes the Biden family as criminals and which, according to the pollsters, would have made a 17-point difference in the election result. And we needed a lot less than that, like about 16.9. It would have been in our favor, not my favor, our favor, because our country is going to hell. And we remember the 51 intelligence agents who said Hunter Biden's laptop was Russian disinformation. It didn't exist. It was Russian disinformation. Remember that? And that was all confirmed strongly by the FBI when they all knew that it wasn't Russian disinformation. And so much more. Our elections were like those of a third world country. And now this massive election interference at a scale never seen before in our country, beginning with the radical left, George Soros-backed prosecutor Alvin Bragg of New York, who campaigned on the fact that he would get President Trump. I'm going to get him. I'm going to get him. This is a guy campaigning. He wanted to get President Trump at any cost, and this before he knew anything about me, didn't know a thing about me. He was campaigning. As it turns out, virtually everybody that has looked at this case, including rhinos and even hardcore Democrats, say there is no crime and that it should never have been brought. Never have been brought. Ever. Even people that aren't big fans have said it. They said this is not the right thing to do. It's an insult to our country as the world is already laughing at us for so many other reasons, like our open borders, our incompetent withdrawal from Afghanistan, where we left behind American citizens, $85 billion worth of the best military equipment in the world, lost 13 magnificent young lives and far too many to mention that are so badly hurt with the loss of arms and legs and facial obliteration. The most embarrassing time in our country's history, in my opinion. Then our give up on energy independence and even energy dominant. We're going to be dominant within 6 months, more than any other nation times 2. We had this all just 3 years ago. Our raging crime statistics, if you look in Democrat-run cities, numbers the likes of which we have never seen before. The open threats by various countries of the use of nuclear weapons, something never mentioned or discussed by outside nations during the Trump administration, and which could very well lead under the Biden administration's leadership to an all-out nuclear World War III. Can happen. We're not very far away from it, believe it or not. An economy that has been crippled by the biggest inflation we have seen in more than 60 years, and a military that I used to defeat ISIS in 4 weeks. They said it would take 4 years. 4 weeks. To kill al-Baghdadi and Soleimani, that has now gone woke at the top levels by trying to indoctrinate everyone down to the lowest ranking patriot. But now they have really stepped up their efforts by indicting the 45th President of the United States, who received $75 million votes, which is more than any sitting president in the history of our country. And in the wings, they've got a local racist Democrat district attorney in Atlanta who is doing everything in her power to indict me over an absolutely perfect phone call, even more perfect than the one I made with the president of Ukraine. Remember, I kept saying that's a perfect call. This one was more perfect. Nobody said, sir, you shouldn't say that. Many people on the phone. Or hung up and discussed because of something I inappropriately said. Because nothing was said wrong. In fact, at the end of the call, we agreed to continue our conversation about election fraud, and election fraud specifically in Georgia, at a later time. Many people on the phone, including lots of lawyers, nobody found anything wrong with that perfect call until a book promotion tour many months later. All of a sudden they say, I remember Trump making a call. Let's look at that. This fake case was brought only to interfere with the upcoming 2024 election, and it should be dropped immediately.
And that was just an excerpt from the live footage that we've been following of Donald Trump giving a speech to his supporters at his Mar-a-Lago estate. Let me get back to you, Mr. Marklow, and excuse me for interrupting your thoughts earlier. Just for you to catch up on the question I asked about the geopolitical changes that may occur at the international arena if Trump is elected again as president.
Very, very difficult to forecast what changes Trump's re-election might actually bring to the geopolitics of a world that is already changing very, very rapidly. Certainly, when talking of Trump, the image of a bull in a china shop springs immediately to mind. So there is, without doubt, good reason and good cause to be concerned as to what new policies might be introduced and how they can impact an already very, very delicate scenario. The United States of America has lost a lot of support. The United States of America is now perceived as having failed on many fronts, is now perceived as no longer supporting other regions, is now perceived as being very, very different from how it was perceived 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. So in this already very delicate situation, it does, from my very, very humble point of view, require somebody who's actually an adult to sit down, sit down with trusted advisors and take a very, very close look at how fast international relations are changing and what the global impact of these changes actually are, and start to take some decisions, reasoning in terms of 20, 30, 40 years, reasoning in terms of where are we headed. All of this in a moment where we have a number of other concerns. If we take a look at the climate issue, absolutely dramatic, and it cannot be divorced from the world of geopolitics, in as much as climate change will bring, as the name suggests, a lot of change, which will influence relationships between different nations. We have on top of this another series of problems that have to be resolved. So now is certainly not the time to create any further disturbances or introduce any major shake-ups. Now is the time for some form of consolidation.
Very nice. And here, let me get back to you, Mr. Dennis Speed. We see during this speech that Trump was delivering, he repeated the false election claims. The former president says he has been attacked with an onslaught of investigation, and his only crime is that he defended his nation. What are your comments about this?
If Donald Trump were allowed to act as an interlocutor with President Vladimir Putin or with President Xi Jinping, you could bring a completely different element into play right now in international relations that would calm everything down. Now, he knows that. And that's why he mentioned what you heard him say about the danger of thermonuclear war. And he's trying to tell his supporters, you aren't being told about this, but I'm telling you, this kind of thing is extremely close. What he has to say about the issue of his election and what happened in that election, these are matters that were suppressed in discussion. Everybody knows about the Hunter Biden laptop as one element of that. But then there was also just the fact that the Russiagate process, remember, there were 2 impeachments of Donald Trump that were brought. An impeachment means an indictment. So what we're having happen today already happened to him twice in the presidency. And what that did was it caused the things he was doing, which involved personal relationships with leaders, heads of state, and particularly those 2 leaders who were extremely important in the world. So I believe that what we are seeing right now unfold, what he's trying to do in his response to today, is take a path that those who are intelligent should follow up on right now, in terms of what the United States finds itself confronted with. And this is not a matter of, quote, interfering in the present policy. It's a matter of a former president. This used to go on all the time, acting on behalf of the United States as a nation and the national interests of the United States, speaking with heads of state or secretaries of state or foreign ministers and so on, for the purpose of, if you will, ameliorating or smoothing over or dialoguing with persons that you believe to be your enemies. If we can't do that, how can the United States claim to be a leading nation in the world?
Very nice indeed. Mr. Dennis Speed, political analyst and founding member of Scheller Institute. You were with us live from New Jersey. Thank you ever so much for joining us. And as mentioned earlier, Finland joining European military alliance makes NATO's border bigger. We will discuss the repercussions of these shortly after this. As NATO military alliance confirmed Finland's accession, Moscow promised that the relations between the 2 nations will change according to Russia's security interests, and that Moscow won't hesitate to take any countermeasures to ensure the safety of Russian population. Here's Sofian Kanturi.
Kremlin said on Tuesday it would be obliged to take countermeasures to ensure Russia's security in response to Finland's accession to NATO military alliance. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov called Zelensky's move to join NATO a threat to Moscow's security due to the European hostile structure towards Russia lately.
The enlargement of NATO is a threat to Russia's security and its national interests. We've talked about this. That's how we see this. And of course, it makes us take countermeasures to provide for our own security, tactically and strategically.
For its part, Russia's foreign ministry said Finland was committing dangerous historical mistake that would fray relations with Moscow and undo its status as confidence-building presence in the Baltic Sea and Europe at large.
This is now a thing of the past. Finland has become one of the small members of NATO that doesn't decide anything, losing its special voice in international affairs. We're sure that history will judge this hasty step.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said in an interview published on Tuesday, the European Union has become hostile and has lost Russia, and Moscow will deal with Europe in a tough fashion if it's necessary.
The European Union has lost Russia, but it's its own fault. It is the EU member countries and EU leaders who openly declare it is necessary to inflict, as they call it, a strategic defeat on Russia.
Finland's accession, ending 7 decades of military non-alignment, roughly doubles the length of border that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization shares with Russia and bolster its eastern flank as the war in Ukraine grinds on with no resolution in sight.
And to enrich the debate even further, joining me live is Eugene Chasovsky, Senior Director in Analytical Development and Training at New Lines Institute. Mr. Eugene, thank you ever so much for agreeing to be with us. And my first question is, the NATO military alliance just got bigger as Finland has become its 31st member. What will change according to you, Mr. Eugene?
Well, I think in the immediate term, there's not going to be any major changes. This was an accession process that started shortly after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I think this was widely expected. It had to go through some bureaucratic hurdles, and now the accession is finally complete. Certainly symbolically, this adds to the contention between Russia and NATO, particularly over Ukraine, but we've seen that spill over in other territories. Now, this could actually change things on the ground depending on if there is going to be an increase in NATO assets and weaponry that goes to Finland. The Russians have alluded to this already, but for the time being, I don't see this actually impacting too much on the ground, at least in the near term.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Mark Lowe, NATO's borders with Russia expanded by 1,300 kilometers, and Russia is vowing countermeasures. What are we expecting to unfold after this, Mr. Mark Lowe?
To be quite frank, I don't expect anything to happen in the immediate term. A lot of statements, a lot of noise, a lot of ridiculous comments. I'm talking of comments and statements that are coming out of Moscow. So for the time being, what is Russia going to do? Russia, at this precise moment in time, isn't going to do anything at all other than release via Lavrov, release via Putin's spokespersons, release via ministers and deputy ministers a series of words. At the end of the day, Putin has achieved the absolute opposite of his original intention. NATO has become stronger. NATO has become larger. NATO hasn't fractured. It hasn't imploded. It hasn't fallen to pieces. It's actually become stronger. Now, none of us would have liked that. None of us would have liked to find ourselves in the scenario that we're living in today. But here we are, and we have to be very, very realistic from a very pragmatic point of view. And please forgive the turn of phrase, but I mean, Russia has enough problems to deal with at the current moment, and it's currently being anything other than successful in resolving these problems. So any extension, any escalation, any opening of new fronts would seem extremely unlikely at best. So for the time being, all I expect from the Russian side are a series of statements and threats and just a lot of hot air, basically.
Clear. And Mr. Adam Roosevelt, the war in Ukraine prompted Finland's application. But what does this mean to the war in Ukraine? Did things get too complicated to resolve now?
Well, being a military veteran and having served in 2 combat tours, I can assure you that there are objectives that are often not talked about. I think that President Vladimir Putin is not just operating at the tactical level where you're seeing the war unfold, the population being impacted, the buildings being destroyed, the bombings, but also what's happening geopolitically. What has President Putin gained today? He has become the czar of the East. How do we know that? We're looking at new trade relations between Russia and Iran. These are record conversations that have not been fully understood, but that definitely means there's a big change happening. Look at what's happening between Russia and OPEC. Look at what's happening between Russia, China, and India. Russia is now having more influence within the supply chain hubs, which means that what we witnessed during COVID as far as the supply chain impact, Russia is now targeting the key supply chain hubs and is revamping its trade relations, its bilateral relations between military states, and that is a bigger objective than just the Ukraine invasion. So I think we need to look at this in terms of a strategic approach because President Vladimir Putin is playing a much different gamble, and his last big game is to attack the US dollar, and now this is a new announcement, and we've got to keep track of all the strategic goals, not just the tactical level invasion.
And Mr. Eugene Chasovsky, some see that Finland's membership is not complete without Sweden. Neighboring Sweden, which had avoided military alliances for more than 200 years, is being stalled by objections from NATO members Turkey and Hungary. How do you see this unfolding, Mr. Eugene?
Well, certainly Sweden and Finland's NATO bid, which came together, we've now seen Finland complete that accession. And as you mentioned, Sweden is further behind due to internal disagreements, particularly with Turkey. But I think that in general, both Sweden and Finland have a lot of interoperability with NATO forces in terms of their weapons, their assets, and even training that will make that accession whenever it happens, a relatively smooth one. And I think we've seen that in the case of Finland as well. So, we do have politics playing out in the meantime, but from a broader strategic perspective, what Russia's invasion of Ukraine has done has really unified NATO countries and countries like Sweden and Finland around the common threat of Russia. But yes, of course, there will always be minor issues to deal with in the meantime. But from the strategic sense, I think that is moving in the direction of continued solidarity, both within NATO and with Ukraine as well.
Back to you, Mr. Mark Lowe. Analysts say that Finland's inclusion in the NATO is a strategic setback, just like Mr. Adam Roosevelt referred to it earlier. So can you explain to us how is this really a strategic setback for Russia? And what can you clarify more about this point in general?
Okay, if I can just clarify one thing first and foremost. My previous comments were as an answer to your specific question regarding Finland's entry into NATO. I say this because I want to follow up by saying that absolutely everything that Dr. Roosevelt said, I agree with entirely, 100%. We have to look at the far, far bigger picture, and here we go back to the comments made during the transmission earlier on when we talked in terms of an eventual second Trump presidency. What will that mean for international relations, etc.? So as I said, I agree absolutely 100%. We are in the midst of a complete change to the world order. We're looking at a new world order directly in the face. And in this new world order, Russia has done very, very well in creating a new role for itself. But going back specifically to the issue of Finland joining NATO, what can I say? NATO now has 31 members. It's bigger, it's stronger. I don't, in all honesty, really have anything else to say. It's a demonstration of the fear that exists amongst NATO members. It's a demonstration of the fear, and I think this is very important, that exists amongst European citizens, and this specifically in regards to Russia's potential and ambitions. If the Finns, who historically have always been against joining NATO, have always been non-aligned, if the recent polls can be trusted, then we have somewhere in the region of 80%, 80% of Finns approving membership of NATO. And this is very, very significant.
Yes, and Mr. Eugene Chasovsky, experts have described Finland's NATO inclusion as a significant moment for European security. And hence we deduce that countries which are neutral obviously can't remain so in today's Europe. What is your comment, Mr. Eugene?
Well, I think certainly countries that are on the front lines of the war in Ukraine, on the front lines of NATO, feel a certain amount of pressure that they can't remain neutral. It's been mentioned before, but public opinion, both within Finland and Sweden, on joining NATO was actually quite low overall until Russia's full-scale invasion, and then that changed dramatically, which really showed that neutrality in this case was not seen as an option. But having said that, I agree with the previous speakers that certainly outside of the West, there are countries that don't necessarily fall in the pro-Russian or the pro-Western camp, and a lot of them have already been mentioned, countries like China, India, the Gulf states, Turkey. So these countries, perhaps not neutral, but they don't fall completely one way or the other, and this is part of an emerging world order that I think is important outside of the immediate European security context.
And Mr. Adam Roosevelt, neutral European states support sanctions for Russia, but oppose direct involvement in the war. Is it possible to remain neutral in today's Europe, Adam Roosevelt, or has that ship long sailed?
Well, I think this is a very complex conversation in regards to sanctions, as you very well probably all would agree that the complexities of sanctions, understanding who the ultimate beneficiaries are from a corporate perspective, being able to leverage intelligence tools to identify what Russians are tied in with different organizations and entities. The labyrinth is very, very complex. The Department of Justice, the CIA, the FBI, NSA, all are looking at trying to unravel this network that is very, very massive, very clever, and understands how to leverage the financial system better than most of the traditional bankers. So I would say it's not simply a sanctions conversation, it is unraveling the sanctions network, understanding how weapons deals are being done, how investments are being done, strategic investments, mergers and acquisitions, even from a Committee of Foreign Intelligence. We've got so many different elements that are not being discussed. So I think the Russians, I think certain nations who have been sanctioned have adapted to the U.S. and NATO in anticipation that sanctions will be leveraged against them. And they are now using even the crypto market to avoid these particular sanctions. And it's getting very complex for the existing investigators.
And Mr. Mark Lowe, countries such as Switzerland, Austria, Malta and Ireland are debating their neutral stance. Do you feel these countries are indeed being pressured to change their stance?
Well, there's an element of being pressured, and there's an element of a feeling that a decision has to be made. These are small countries. These are countries that in certain cases have done very, very well for themselves. Look at Ireland, look at Switzerland. But they remain very small and on the world stage, fairly insignificant countries. They are countries that provide services for others. The Swiss via the financial systems, the banking system, the Republic of Ireland through having had the ability to create a technological hub and a services hub halfway between Europe and the United States of America. But one way or another, there has to be some form of alignment. A small country has to align itself with, in these days, a small country has to align itself with one bloc or with another. So that, if you like, is a form of inherent pressure, basically.
And back to you, Mr. Eugene Chosovsky. Can any of these neutral European countries act as mediators whatsoever in this conflict?
Well, we've seen different attempts at mediation, but I think that any country that is certainly within the EU, or any country that's sanctioned Russia within the EU or NATO, basically is not going to be able to serve as an effective mediator. The one exception that we've seen has been Turkey, which is a NATO member, but it has not pursued sanctions against Russia. So I think from a European perspective, it's unlikely. We saw attempts by both France and Germany to play mediating roles before this full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but prior to the 2014 period. That obviously ended up not working out, and we've seen the escalation since then. More likely, we're going to see non-Western, non-European countries play mediating roles. I've mentioned Turkey before, but even some of the Gulf states, and we've seen China attempt to do so. It's going to be very difficult, but I think that any mediating country has to have a degree of a relationship with both Russia and with Ukraine. So that, I think, inherently disqualifies, in a sense, a lot of European countries from playing a mediating role.
Clear indeed. And Mr. Adam Roosevelt, any comment regarding that?
Well, I think I would advocate for the obvious choice, which often is not put forward, and I believe that the United Arab Emirates would be a very strong mediator. So we have the UAE as an option. We have, from a Western perspective, we would not tend to submit this recommendation, but China is also playing a vital role in playing a mediator. So we have to determine who is the preferred option. If we go with China, we know that China is a strategic investor. It has so many different things to benefit from its Belt and Road Initiative strategy, and this would play a major benefit toward them. But I think the UAE could play a larger role given what they've been able to accomplish, but some may argue against that position given the blacklist currently.
Very nice indeed. Mr. Mark Lowe, any final words?
Yeah, just raising the issue of sanctions. We've seen once again that in reality our sanctions are anything other than efficient. We've seen once again that those that suffer the most from sanctions are actually, I'm speaking from Europe, so I will talk specifically about the European reality, European countries. So it's also a case for, at a certain point, stopping, taking a very close look at how sanctions are imposed, how they actually work, what level of efficiency they have, learning a few very, very important lessons, and thinking very, very carefully in the future in regards to introducing sanctions on countries such as, in this case, we're speaking specifically about Russia, but on any other country. Who, at the end of the day, suffers from what I see at the moment? Those that are suffering the most from these several rounds of sanctions against Russia are actually the European countries rather than Russian interests. So that's another issue for another day. But what we have seen over the past year has very, very much taught us the lesson that sanctions at the end of the day are, yes, of course, they're very, very technical. It's very, very hard to identify against whom, against which organizations. That's very, very difficult. It takes up a lot of time. But we've seen that in any case, they simply are not efficient. And therefore, as a tool, are they still a viable option? Questions that a lot of governments are going to have to ask themselves in the near future.
Very nice indeed. Thank you so much, Mr. Mark Lowe, Adam Roosevelt, Dennis Spade, and Eugene Chosovsky. Thank you, our guests, for all your insightful analysis. And thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on our channel. Till next time, take care.